to you Dr. Anuradha Kanniganti, who is a mathematician by training with a PhD in statistics, as you can read in the introduction to her abstract. Anuradha tells me that she's had a very interesting experience of having lived and worked across 3 continents. She was born in Hyderabad and she's been educated in the US and is currently living in Paris at the National Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilizations, where she teaches on the Telugu program. And she's also doing a lot of literary activities, including a translation activity with a French colleague. Another interesting thing that I learned from Anuradha is that she's a truly multilingual practitioner. She's raised a 16-year-old son who can speak Telugu, English, and French, and also Spanish, Latin, and ancient Greek. So over to you, Anuradha.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. That was a kind introduction. Good morning, everybody. I'm really very happy to have this opportunity to share some thoughts with you on some new directions I feel that we could take in looking at the issues that have been discussed in very great depth in the last couple of days concerning the problematic relationship of multilingualism with modernization, with economic change, with development, and the resulting inequities and inequalities are due to concentration of power in certain languages and the marginalization of others. So first, I'd like to start my presentation by reacting to some extent to some of the things we've been hearing the last 2 days. Essentially, a lot of the energies were devoted to looking at the problem of multilingualism in the educational domain, especially in primary education across Asia and Africa, essentially. And we saw that this raises a lot of passions, a lot of research energies, advocacy, and including also a lot of heartburn concerning the marginalization and even the disappearance of multiple languages which are left by the roadside, and the populations concerned who suffer from deprivation of opportunity, of self-development, of empowerment, etc. So that I do not need to summarize again this debate because we've been hearing it quite a lot. There's many aspects to it. Actually, it turns out it's very complex, the choice of language in education. It's not just a domination of English over others. It's, as we saw in different speakers' presentations, that there can be actually multiple reasons, sociological, political, cultural, etc. But we also saw that there is something like a rationality in the choice of English over the mother tongue in education, but there's also a huge part of irrationality. So it's a very interesting combination of rationality and irrationality. The rationality seems to come up in a kind of emotive need, a psychological need, a state of, we could call it a remnant of a colonial consciousness, still operating within the mentalities of people, where there is what one could call, if you wish to go into psychology or psychoanalysis, if I'm not at all conversant with those fields, but in French there is an expression called désir, which like désir d'anglais, I call it désir d'anglais, it's a desire for English. And on the other hand, I also think of the image, when I think of the demand for English, especially in India or in many African countries, it's almost like the water supply, for which it's a public, seen as a public good by many people now. And there's this demand that the state take over the assurance of this supply of English to everybody, because like water or electricity, it's seen as an essential, kind of an essential attribute for proper life. So it's a very interesting conundrum. Now, so the rush for English medium instruction, we've seen all the causes. The consequences are definitely very worrisome in terms of all the factors that were laid out, like the quality, the students losing out at the end in multiple ways, as Birgit outlined last evening in her plenary session, in multiple ways, and also notably on even linguistic diversity. In India, all the major languages are under severe pressure, and you regularly see in the newspapers articles. For example, I come from the Telugu language, and there's regularly every other day an article in the Telugu press, essentially just lamenting over the danger to the language. Just it's all the time, it's seen as a crisis. It's a Sanskrit terms, bhasha, sankshobham. Bhasha means language, and sankshobham is crisis, catastrophe. So it's a language catastrophe which is in the making, with this massive shift going on to EMI. Whether it's good or bad, that's the parents don't seem to care. So now we also looked at solutions, some suggested solutions and strategies. And I have not been to all the sessions, so I'm only reacting to the ones I've seen. We had an extremely positive view of the potential of digital technologies and tools to piggyback, to leapfrog over traditional language barriers. That's indeed a very promising development, especially if we have massive translation. We have generalization, universalization of internet access, and we have all kinds of platforms. In India, the government is planning to do that, so that's indeed an extremely promising opening for languages. In the education domain, there was identified a very important information gap concerning parents and other stakeholders when they make language choice in education. So there is indeed work to be done on overcoming that information gap and changing mindsets, and it's a process. And as someone said yesterday, if feminism could overcome misconceptions about women's capacities, one of these days that could happen for marginalized languages as well. And there was an extremely interesting suggestion by Birgit last evening of a strategy, a very pragmatic strategy to start working on, actually as a part of the information of addressing the information gap, to actually focus on the economic value of languages, since that seems to be the principal reason for language shift in education. And also she mentioned putting in conditionalities in employment opportunities in terms of language skills, but I think that has its limitations. It's already present in India to some extent, and this can only work for public sector employment and definitely not for private sector employment. And the huge language shift in education is essentially linked to private sector employment. It's not public sector employment that people are so excited about today. So that's to be seen. She did mention, for example, in Tanzania, that a big, massive part of national wealth is actually created with activity in African languages. And this is the factor that I really wish to focus on in my presentation today, this economic aspect to language. We also had mention of linguistic rights. Now, what would that mean? That's a big issue in itself. And I think there was a pre-conference event where it was probably discussed in depth, and so I will just leave it as an idea there. Linguistic rights, essentially, from what, for example, what I have noticed in the Indian scenario, would involve giving quotas, like we have quota systems for other ethnic factors, like caste and so on. Now, can we imagine a quota type situation for language? There has been definitely a demand for that. For example, in the case of Telugu, has been continuous demand to give preference to Telugu speakers in public sector jobs and requiring language skills, etc. Once again, every other day, there's somebody writing about that in the newspapers, how we, in order to assure the survival of the language, we need to make sure that jobs are reserved for people who can actually master the language. So this is an important idea, but again, with a lot of limitations, and implementations will be very difficult. And as I said, public sector employment is no longer so attractive to people today in aspirational contexts. Voilà. So that needs to be seen, but I think essentially when we speak about rights, it's not so much about big languages, but about really small languages. So that's another topic, and I'm not focusing at all, and other people have done it, on small languages and their issues. I want to also react to the idea of preserving diversity. As a value in itself, we can make an opposition between an intrinsic value of language and an instrumental value of language. So a lot of the discourse about preserving linguistic diversity at all costs, and also promoting ideas like equity between languages, which we've also heard in the last couple of days. It's nice to hear, but I personally am a little bit dubitative about the idealized or utopic view of all languages being equal. They are equal in an intrinsic sense. They're not, after that, what can we do with that idea? That's another issue. There's also denigration in some types of discourse on language protection, language defense, language advocacy, that economics is something to be denigrated, that it's something out there which is a big bad wolf. It's out there, it's something we have to fight against. I actually also submit that I question that view, which is somewhat ideologically colored. So I think we need to take a dispassionate look at how language functions in the economy, how economics and language are intertwined, and that could take us a long way towards actually evolving intelligent policies for languages. And that's really my argument. All right, after that, there's also a somewhat aesthetic appeal of the idea of the diversity, and it's nice. It's nice. It's just like we all would love the planet to have biodiversity. We would love to have all the languages being alive. Now, once again, what can we do with that idea? It's like a wicked problem. This is a term from Professor Mufwani of Chicago, who's a very good, very famous linguist. And this is kind of the idea of satisficing in mathematical modeling. When you are trying to reconcile conflicting objectives, we talk about satisficing solutions where you do not maximize either objective, you end up making a compromise. So what would be the ideal compromise between diversity and development? So that's a big question and something to think about. So once I do wish to focus a little bit, because originally this was my starting point for this reflection on language and inequality. We have talked a lot about this in the last 2 days, so we are all very much aware that the way especially post-colonial nations are set up, there's an inherent structural inequality in access to multiple services, opportunities, the right to expression, and multiple things. So there are severe inequalities. In economics, economists have been looking at inequality for all ethnic, coming from ethnicity. And for example, you have the Harvard economist Alesina, who's published a lot on ethnic inequality. It's worth looking at. And there's a notion of fractionalization of societies, whether fractionalized with respect to multiple ethno-linguistic variables. And there you have a comparison between, like, for example, a very, very homogeneous country like France, which still has a non-zero fractionalization index. And India and Tanzania have very high fractionalization index, as we already know. So it does present extreme challenges. Now, there's another idea which I really liked, put forward by Rouhani. It's the idea of multilingualism being actually riven through by inequalities of all kinds, which are structural, inherent, sociocultural, and this is a underlying characteristic of multilingualism everywhere. Even in developed countries, for example, recently I was talking to someone who lives in the region of Valencia in Spain, and the local language there is one of the several important languages of Spain. But the economy of that region, related to the economy, for example, of Castilla, is not as significant. I mean, so there's always a hierarchy of some kind. Okay, now the important aspect is, what is the impact of these inequalities of multilingualism on socioeconomic outcomes? What is the relationship? There have really been very few studies which have comprehensively addressed this issue. They have largely restricted themselves to migrant languages. For example, in Canada, you have a lot of studies, especially of a difference in revenues between English-speaking and French-speaking people. Or after that, that's of course the problem of English and French. But after that, you have also on linguistic, the French-speaking or linguistic minority in Canada, of course. So there have been studies on that, and there in Europe, in the European Union, there are many, many studies on linguistic minorities. Now, what about widely spoken but still marginalized large languages? They equally, they have a lot of issues and problems today. As I mentioned, for the Telugu language or other Indian languages, there's a sense of a crisis. With all the current generations not preferring to study in Telugu or even to study the Telugu language. Today's students do not even wish to study Telugu even in an English medium school. They do not wish to study Telugu. So this is really a crisis. So I wish to operate a shift in focus, change the angle of view, and talk about the aspiration for mobility, which is the driving force behind these problems. And this is a very legitimate aspiration, and people are choosing English or other dominant languages for that reason. So can we address the problem of aspiration for mobility without passing through, for example, English, and it could be another language elsewhere, but in our context, largely it's been English. So the désir d'anglais, which is the desire for English, how can it be overcome? Is it just information? Can we just give information about educational outcomes being equally good through the vernacular medium, through the mother tongue? Is that going to be sufficient? I don't think it's going to be sufficient, because the macro environment for socioeconomic mobility is sending out very strong messages that English is the passport to absolute a passport to very desirable success. And in India, especially, the success of the economic advantage of the English language for India in terms of the development of the new economy, the IT sector, the ITES outsourcing and it's a call center type of activity. All of that is about English, and this is a success model for millions and millions of young people. So it's an extremely strong message coming from above about the model of success, and how are we going to counter this macroeconomic, this macro factor of messages or even facts about what success means and what people want. I mean, so how are we going to do that? Well, once again, so this is where I wish to propose a shift in focus. And let's see if we can actually, in certain contexts, think about actually growing what I call the vernacular economies, the local population, the local language economies. Can they actually be not equalized, but can the opportunity gap be reduced with English? Of course, in the context of English, and elsewhere it could be another dominant language. How can we conceive of empowering local languages for better economic opportunities, better economic performance. The perception problem here, the information problem, is not only about educational outcomes. If you choose the mother tongue, you can do better, your child will learn better, etc. There's that concerns education. But I think there's a huge information gap also about what is actually language doing in the economy. What kind of work do we do in each language? What value is it producing? What is the value, for example, of the Telugu language? What are the sectors in which Telugu is actually very prominent and active? I can give you an example. In the city of Hyderabad, which is one of the most dynamic cities in India, of course, it's one of the key centers for the IT sector, which functions, of course, in English, exclusively in English. But if you go across just 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, you have the huge Telugu industry of cinema. The huge Telugu film industry, and in India, the film industry is actually a huge generator of wealth and employment. This industry functions in the Telugu language. Okay, so right there you have, within a few kilometers of each other, you have a huge English-based industry and you have a huge Telugu-based industry. So I don't see why we cannot, we should really be pursuing this process, these pathways of reflecting about the economies of our languages. What are they doing in the economy? What value are they? So we need to understand the linguistic structure of the economy, and I don't think this is currently an object of any reflection. I would love to learn about any work being done on that. So once again, there is a lack of understanding. When parents reason about English being the language for socio-economic success, they don't necessarily know what the opportunities are in the Telugu language, for example. They don't necessarily know that. I recently spoke to a counselor in a university and asked them, do you talk to your students about opportunities available to them after they graduate? No, they don't do that. They don't do that. So I would also, I made a triangle here with missing links between different factors that structure these relationships between mobility, between outcomes, socioeconomic outcomes, and language. So I identified 3 things which are linked to each other, and then there are external factors as well. So first we have our multilingualism, and we are very concerned with socioeconomic development. So what is the link between the two? This question is actually not addressed. A few years ago, I really looked for literature on this, and I know there was a thesis done in African context by Dr. Robinson, who's at UNESCO, I think now, and he did he studied in his thesis a relationship between multilingualism and economic performance, I think, but I haven't seen that many studies on that. So after that, we have the third leg of my triangle, where I put in language development as a kind of, language development is the development of infrastructure in languages so that they can perform functions of all kinds. And this is definitely sorely lacking. And so the 3 go together in producing new realities for languages, I feel. And when I write supply and demand on the bottom, it's that just producing tools or language infrastructure is not enough in itself. You need policy, of course. You need the right environment for those tools to be applied and be productive. You also need informed citizens who don't have misconceptions that English is the only language, etc. That things are possible, that you can become a very successful entrepreneur and just remain within the Tamil language or the Telugu language. These are things that people don't know. So, so I feel we should be exploring those linkages. And the types of questions which arise from those linkages are, is linguistic diversity, how can we actually claim that it's an asset for development? I haven't really seen any convincing arguments. I have only seen emotive or yes, people would like that to be true. We have to question that. As we saw earlier, ethno-linguistic fractionalization, according to economists, is actually problematic for development, for economic indices, indicators, etc. If we enhance capacities of language to do different new things, can that automatically, or can that lead to socio-economic development? It's actually very much indicated today by the use of the internet and all these digital tools to do new activities. So I think there's a positive answer there. And then there's another issue which is very interesting, which is the growth, economic growth. If you're in a low growth scenario, that's one thing. If you're in a high growth scenario, it's another. In fact, a lot of the problems we see with Indian languages and English today is in the context of India's high growth trajectory in the last 3 decades. And this high growth trajectory has enormously increased expectations of people and their aspirations. So this is why there's an acceleration of choice of English, because they wish to be part of that growth story, and it's perfectly normal. However, high growth can actually put pressure on languages by preferring the market languages, so giving more weight to market languages. On the other hand, could we say then that low growth is actually a benign preserver of linguistic diversity, because it doesn't really open up these types of fractures, of opportunity divides between languages, maybe. So there is questions there. So high growth, is it good? Is it bad for diversity, for languages? That's a question. So there are all kinds of questions that we could be pursuing to better understand the linkages between language, economy, and people's aspirations, all of those things. So as I just said, there's a typology of situations we could definitely look at. I've been to conferences in Europe with the discussion of diversity in Europe, for example, and they are very much concerned that the European Union only wants to promote the large languages which have a market value. So this, you see, it's not just India, it's not just Africa. And that puts in question funding, etc., for promotion of the smaller languages. So, and we just saw, we have the post-colonial states is another configuration. So I feel we could develop a typology of situations when we look at solutions and strategies. It's not all the same box. Okay, so I want to come to my key theme here, which is economics, work, and language, an totally underexplored domain, especially for us here, very much concerned with the survival and well-being of as many languages as possible. So, as I just said, it's a relatively young field. Actually, it's now taking off. As a field, language economics is hardly around 30 years old. The major papers started to be written then, and today it's really picking up slowly, and there are more and more conferences and so on. But it's very tough to actually produce theory because it's very complex. You can't isolate a language and study it in isolation when you're in a multilingual situation. So there's a lot to be done there. So for language advocacy, I'm proposing that really this could provide us very useful frameworks for reflecting on the issues we are concerned with. We know that the language issue is a low political priority in the majority of situations. So for politicians and deciders to actually pay attention to language, we need to provide very solid, concrete, fact-based and figure-based arguments. For example, if you were to invest in developing languages, pushing them forward, making them, for example, technically more proficient, would that investment result in certain outcomes? So this is the type of technocratic arguments that I think we should be able to develop, and that would be listened to by politicians and deciders. So once again, if you typically a decider or politician will probably tune out if you start talking about rights, but if you talk to them about cost benefit, they'll probably listen. So it involves investing in improving the profile of languages for economic relevance. So we have to convince decision makers about that. So I want to spend a little bit of time on a exploratory study that I'm doing now to look at the English vernacular interface in a setting, in an industrial setting, so in an very key economic setting. As we've been repeatedly saying, the Indian languages are of course very much neglected all across the board, all across the chain of manpower formation. We have seen that in spite of the government investing huge amounts of funds in primary education, the teacher training itself and the teacher salaries takes up a big chunk of that. There are very, very good training programs for teachers, etc. But then they don't go to school, they don't go to class, but that's another issue. But the problem is, all across the board, there's a problem of, there's a problem all across the chain. So I'm going to look at the educational divide, the linguistic divide, where one language is favored and all the others are neglected. What happens when people actually go out into the workplace? What happens then? How do they negotiate the language frontier between the power language, the major language of technological and scientific work in India, and then their languages in which they are not necessarily well trained or well educated? So I have looked at, since I come from Hyderabad and it's a major center for pharmaceutical industries in India, 50% of the pharmaceutical sector is present in Hyderabad, and so that was a natural domain for me to look at. And typically, just to go very fast, there are, how am I doing for time, please? Okay, good. So there are generally 3 levels of employees, and if you look at the structure of a factory or an industrial situation, you'd have a correlation between the employee levels. There could be, within the 3 levels, there will of course be multiple sub-levels. There's a correlation between educational level and linguistic proficiency, a kind of how shall we call it, a gamme in French, a range between absolute total monolingualism, sometimes illiteracy, and all the way up to extremely highly qualified English-speaking people. So that's a very, very interesting thing to look at to begin with. That's where we have to start. And so I gave some details because these details are really interesting. So I looked at 4 cases of different levels, different sizes of companies, and the size of the company makes a big difference as well. So there's small, medium, and large, and of course there's also what are called micro and tiny. And all these different situations will give rise to totally different configurations of language in the workplace, and also different levels of investment of the employer in developing, kind of facing the linguistic situation and making it more functional and efficient. So, so there is a medium-sized company producing, some chemicals, and in this case, you see that the PDG, the CEO claimed, in India, all across India, even English-educated people actually, we all prefer to speak in our language in the workplace. It's very fascinating fact. So he said our comfort zone, even the highly educated, so-called, quote-unquote, highly educated people in English language actually largely prefer to converse and to communicate in their own language in an industrial setting. And of course, so he claimed that on the factory floor, all communication was in Telugu. And then I said, what about written language? What about the written environment? How is that for the Telugu language? So they're beginning to translate technical documents so that the workforce, which is quote-unquote largely monolingual, can actually participate in be a part of the technical team. Be conversant and be educated. Sorry, oops, excuse me. So just to finish on that topic, he says enlightened companies actually are beginning to invest in the local languages so that the workforce is actually an informed workforce, is actually well-trained workforce. This is a new value in India. A new value, the idea that the workforce should be well-trained. Traditionally, it has not been the case. They just hire and then I've actually done some work on that. They hire on the managerial practices, they hire and then it's kind of a command management where you tell people, you do this, you do this, you do this. And they do it. They are not trained. They don't have a takeaway in terms of an acquired standardized competence, but this is now really, really changing. It's become a huge priority for India. So we'll again see that point a little bit later. So the attention to language, he says, is not organized. It's kind of ad hoc. It's here and there. It's according to people's choices, etc. So it's kind of beginning. It's at a beginning stage, but he is very gung-ho about that. And he himself translates using Google Translator. You see, that's the whole issue here. An extremely important industrial sector to communicate with its workforce, to teach them, to train them, has to use Google Translate. It's really sad. Okay, I mean, because we all know what the quality of that is. So anyway, so that's the lack of an organized setup to actually address the linguistic issue in production. Quality, in regulation, in security, in standardization of operations, etc. Second interesting question is a large pharmaceutical company, and the discourse is totally dry and very clear. We don't care. We don't care. All our documentation is in English. They just manage somehow. And he was using the example of cell phones. He said 850 million Indians have cell phones. The cell phones so far have largely just been in English. Everybody somehow manages. So we somehow manage. In Hindi, we have a term called chalta hai. Somehow we go. So this is a kind of national philosophy. But it cannot gel with a modern economy, and the Indian decision makers are now have realized this and are really doing something about it. So the managing somehow cannot continue. Another totally contrasting case is again very fascinating, because this is a pharmaceutical company which was taken over by a European company, and a European company is very serious about its own European country where they come from is extremely serious about their own language. They are very devoted to their own language. So when they came in and they saw that the Telugu language was not being used, there was no literate environment in the Telugu language, they insisted on creating one, because they said we need to respect the language of our workers and to teach them in their own language. So that's again another configuration, and that's totally, it's a really well done process. But once again, what did they do? They found somebody in the company who actually is very good in Telugu and in English, and this guy is translating all the technical documents. So that's again an ad hoc type of case-by-case type of solution, not a systemic one, not an organized solution. Okay, so that's what's going on right now with that. So the idea there is that the employees should know what they're doing. Now, it's not that the company suddenly decided on this very benevolent attitude. It's that if they want to export to the United States, the Federal Drug Administration requires, it's written down in the contract, that the employees have to know exactly what procedures they're doing. They have to know the reasons. They have to have a full understanding of that. So they have to have the access to the documents and be trained. So this is something coming from above and forcing this change. And there's another company, this is not in Hyderabad, but in Mumbai, and there's another language policy. So we can begin to talk about language policies in organizations and start to look at that. It's really very informative and very instructive. They don't bother at all with the Marathi language. They just say, if you want to work for us, you need to be able to read English. That's it. I mean, it's like that. So you see, it's just a variation, even in the small sample that I have looked at. There is quite a variation in the attitudes to how to face the problem of the interface, the technical interface between the interface between language, technology, language and technical knowledge, technical training, technical competence, etc. So the conclusion of that, I just summarized the very, very quick findings of this exploratory survey. It's so I will move on since time is limited. Now I want to finish this part by also giving you another thing I've been doing, which is to talk to people about in which language medium they study, and then what they do afterwards, and if it enables them to succeed in life. So, for example, another person I have talked to who works in really one of the leading pharmaceutical companies in India, a very famous one. He got a really good job as a scientist in that company, and he didn't know a word of English. Okay, but he was really good. He was a very good student. He got top marks, and he did really well in the interview without speaking English. So you see, he was hired, and that's an enlightened company. And he's doing really well. And then he just picked up English when he was there, whatever English he required to know. And then an astonishing statement by a professor in one of the leading universities in India. He said, if Indian scientists and researchers were allowed to write in their own languages, they would produce a lot more. The language is a barrier. English, having to write in proper English is a barrier. See, you see, it's really profound. I was astonished by that statement, and I think it would be a beginning for really a big opening in our mentalities in India, and I hope elsewhere as well, that people really think better in their own languages. They may go to university in English, they may spend 25 years in it, and they are still more familiar with their own language and would rather write in their own language. So the last part of my presentation today is, once again, I'm going back to the high growth emerging economy and the changes that are happening, which could actually represent a very big change point for major Indian languages. I'm looking at the large languages, which are the official languages, which are the medium of instruction. For large numbers of Indians, 95% of the Indian population is concerned by the 22 languages in the Constitution of India. So I'm focusing on that 95% and their development. So a shift in the discourse comes from the fact that India's high growth trajectory, they want to go up to 10%, 11%, 12%, very ambitious. To do that, you need an industrial workforce, and we don't have the proper industrial workforce. We don't have it. We have extremely low level of skilled manpower in India. It's the lowest probably in all the emerging economies. China, for example, I think 82% of their workforce is actually skilled and trained. In India, it's less than 10%. So you see, it's a big, big, big gap. And the present government's ambition to become an industrial powerhouse just cannot go anywhere without those millions of people actually getting trained to do the work of industrial production. And we just don't have those people today. So there is a very ambitious policy with a huge amount of funding called the National Skill Development Policy. And every day you'll see in the newspaper, you open the newspaper, you'll see an article on that, because it's a priority. And then there's a second one called Digital India Initiative. These two, I feel, are going to become a change point for Indian languages together, because so far they've been in a cultural ghetto, where you touch any politician or even any society leader, they will say, oh, what do you think of what's happening to Indian languages? They will say, oh, they're very nice for culture. You know, I respect them. And then they'll say, but we need English for global competitivity. So this is the regular discourse. So that culture tag, and I think it's true not just in India, but across the board in many, many other linguistic situations. So to technical functions, to productive functions, which can produce value and which can raise the socio-economic profile of people. So that's really what it's all about. And in relation to, of course, digital tools and technologies, because all of that's going to be happening with the digital platforms, the massive training will require two things. One is the digital platforms for delivery of training, and secondly, the use of Indian languages. It has to go through that. In spite of the Honorable Minister who spoke to us on the first day and said, please tell us how to teach English to our yeah, he really wanted this conference to contribute to their understanding of how they could teach English skills. That's fine, but it's really more about the English skills have their place, but it's really more about the use of native languages in producing this massive workforce. Take a look at this very interesting statement by the minister responsible for skill development. The government has created a separate ministry, so you can see how important strategically this is for India today. And he says that the day when a plumber has as much status, of course that's a utopic view, but in terms of attractivity as a marriage candidate, that day we'd really have arrived as a skilled nation, and that day we'd really have arrived at socio-economic mobility for people who have not studied in English, who are not working in the IT sector, who have real, veritable alternatives for livelihoods, well-paying alternatives. So that's a wonderful statement. Language cannot be a barrier for one's credentials to get a job. So I'll finish with, I'm throwing out a number of ideas. They're all just in a gestation stage. The first idea I want to talk about is a concept that I call vernacular economies. So I think we should be growing a veritable multilingual economy here, and not a kind of a single language economy which is pulling the growth story and then leaving behind everybody else. So equalizing the terrain for languages is really about improving vernacular economies. In the vernacular, there's already an economy. It's the traditional sectors, agriculture, all the cultural fields like cinema. It's a very big industry in India, as I said. There's a lot of activities actually which actually produce value. Many of them are in the informal sector, and they should be brought in the formal sector. For example, an extremely important industrial sector, which is in the traditional part of the vernacular economy, is the craft sector. The craft sector has a huge potential, if it's modernized, to become a wealth generator and employ millions of people. But it's moribund, it's dying, it's just due to negligence and ignorance. So a network of modern schools could be established in languages where the children of these families could actually have very modern education in crafts and become entrepreneurs and creators and be making lots of money compared to what they are doing today. Today it's an extremely under-regarded and despised sector. In spite of everybody, the urban people buying crafts, they don't realize what a despised thing it is. So that's one example. And then the modern sectors which have to emerge. And I also propose a whole range of new concepts and tools which I'm really beginning to look at. They are not easy to actually get into. One is the linguistic mapping of the economy. There is a concept of mapping. I'm finished? Yeah, this is the last. So these are all the ideas that I'm throwing out. Just the beginning. There's a language part of work. I also want to propose a kind of Gini coefficient for language to measure the inequality of language in any multilingual situation. I have a definition of that. And so to finish, my proposals are that really we should have massive investment of research energies and even advocacy for putting forward native languages, or whatever we want to call them, in the economic domain, to develop them as appropriate tools of production. Language should be viewed as a tool of production and not just as an indicator of culture. And then I also really I really want to pursue the idea of prestige planning and other strategies. And the devoir d'informer, which is in French means the duty to inform. We all involved in the language research or advocacy domains have a duty to inform people of really things that they have misconceptions about. And so there should be a messaging strategy, a production of messages, fact-based, to inform people about the real, veritable nature of how things work, and not give way to irrational delusions about buying English and automatically becoming an IT, whatever, and go to America the next day. Thank you very much.
Very interesting presentation of the relationship between language, technology, and the economy. And I'm really sorry to have interrupted. This was a really interesting presentation, and I'm sure there would be a lot of questions and observations for you. We have time for just about 2 or 3 questions, and then the session ends. Do you have the mic there, please? Yeah.
I have a very contradictory view to your last statement. You said that today we learn English and tomorrow we plan to go to US. But the thing is that if you flip it, don't we have a right to give to those aspirants a dream at least? By denying them that opportunity to learn English, aren't we doing them an injustice? That's my concern.
Thank you. I actually said at many, many points in my presentation that I respect the aspirations, and I perfectly understand why people would want to do that. My argument is only about providing alternatives, because not everybody can go to America. Not everybody, you know how many jobs exist in the IT sector, in the ITES sector? Just a few millions, 12 million jobs. The number of people in India who are going to be looking for work in a few years is 500 million. So that's not the answer. That's all I meant. I just absolutely did not say, or would not say that people shouldn't have aspirations or that they shouldn't pursue them. I just said, I hope I'm very clear on that. Okay.
Any more questions? Alison there?
Thank you very much, Anuradha. It was a really interesting presentation. I was interested to hear your quite pragmatic approach to language development for the workplace. I wondered if you thought there was a role for some kind of standards for linguistic competence across Indian languages that might help facilitate the provision of better training, assessments, and quality of delivery.
Absolutely. I think it's totally lacking because of, we just have not paid attention to Indian languages from this angle, that there could be veritable agents of economic value production. It's just totally neglected. So I think honestly, there's very exciting research possibilities in this domain if people were to pay attention. And my concept is that if we were to do it for one group of languages, it could be applied to other groups of languages across the world. Africa, Latin America, etc., wherever there is diversity and large languages covering huge swaths of population.
Yeah, I must congratulate you for the excellent presentation. My name is Rajiv. You talked of vernacular economy. However, I have a concern here, which I would like the House to deliberate on. Majority of the job-generating professional courses are not at all available in the vernacular languages. They are all available in the English language.
Absolutely.
And I have, like you had been giving pharmaceutical companies examples, and I have taught in one of the colleges B Pharma students who came from vernacular medium, and I found them doing very good when it was related to calculation kind of papers like pharmacology and etc. But when it came to placements, it was a very, disappointing.
They didn't get the job.
Yeah.
So my example was a counter example of the guy who got the job, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's your comment, yeah? Yes, I agree totally with you. The scenario is very discouraging, but once again, I think it's related to ignorance and preconceptions. And I think we could have a role to play in overcoming these preconceptions, and also opening up like the attitudes, like I showed in one of my case study examples, where there are enlightened industrialists who are actually recognize the value of using the language for communication, technical communication. So this is something, it's a new message, it's a totally new message. And it should be taken up, and I even have a kind of radical idea that language, in addition to all the ethnic factors in India, should become a vote bank. That all these vernacular medium students who end up really being in a limbo of no opportunities, and they somehow become auto rickshaw drivers, taxi drivers, with an MA in literature or whatever they have, and or even go back and do very, very menial jobs. These people constitute a vote bank, in my view. And if we were to inform them properly, they could put pressure on politicians to actually do something for Indian languages. Yes.
I am from a public sector bank.
Right.
And you are very right. In India, the banking sector people attend only 20-25%. But in this portion, we have opened 9 crore accounts due to Indian languages, because we have prepared the publicity, how to open the account, how to operation in the bank. That is only due to Indian languages. And the people are far away from the banking due to English one. And you are very right, because we are not using our force due to this lack of language.
Yeah, it's like a huge economic potential just waiting. It's like a gold mine just waiting to be tapped. Yes.
No, I think here government has to play a major role. Why vernaculars are not getting any importance? Because the government is also not giving any importance. When I see these employment news, and I find that even for the vacancy of a safai wala, that is a cleaner or a sweeper, they say that the test of English will also be held. I say that even if a cleaner does not know English, if he will not be able to clean properly? So I think I would like to know your views also, that whether government has a major role to play here or not.
Well, as I said, governments traditionally don't care about language because there is no lobby for language. So I think if you were to inform the concerned citizens that their rights are being trampled upon by the negligence of the government of providing them the right framework to develop their own economic trajectories, socio-economic trajectories, this would be a pressure factor. But this is all again about informing people and making them mobilized to really defend their rights, their linguistic. This is the real linguistic right. The right to employment is linked with language. It's scandalous that to be a sweeper, you should have an English test. It is absolutely scandalous in a country like India. I mean, that itself should produce a social revolution. Why don't we have a revolution for language when it's extremely discriminatory? It's total discrimination. It's as bad as caste discrimination or any other discrimination, okay? I think it's outrageous that you should have an English test for becoming a sweeper. So let the sweepers of the country get organized and put pressure on the politicians. I mean, that's where it should go, I feel.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've kind of come to the end of our time here. I'm sure if anybody has more questions for Anuradha, she would be happy to interact outside the room. So we come to the end of this session, and thank you, Anuradha, and this is a memento for you. Thank you very much on behalf of the organizers. Thank you.